Back in 2010, I was diagnosed with a fatal disease. Even the name of it still gives me the shivers, and I'd rather not go into the details of it. All you need to know is it affected my brain, and the doctors gave me a 5% chance of surviving another 2 years. There was nothing they could do for me, they said. I was told it was best to put my affairs in order and make arrangements to enter a hospice eventually. They didn't know what caused my disease. It was possible I had been exposed to certain chemicals in my work as an engineer, but then again, it might have been nothing to do with that. Here's the thing, I didn't have anyone depending on me, and I decided I'd rather spend my last year or two doing something I enjoyed rather than waiting to die. I figured I'd just off myself if the symptoms got too bad to handle. I have a kind of phobia of hospitals which I acquired in the course of watching my father die in one. My particular fear was that I'd be walking around doing some shopping or something and I'd collapse and I'd wake up in a hospital. Then they'd transfer me to some care home or hospice and I'd be stuck there. You can say all this was irrational and I should have got over my fears or whatever, but that was how I felt about it, and with 2 years left to live, at the most, I wasn't going to let anyone change my mind. I sold my house in Nottingham and I said goodbye to my friends. We had a bit of a farewell drink together. I didn't actually tell any of them I was dying. I told them I was going to live in a hut somewhere in the wilds of Eastern Europe with a view to writing a book about it, so I'd be out of touch for a couple of years. Then I packed some essentials into my car and I started driving towards the south coast of England. I put Highway to Hell on the radio, and for about an hour I felt pretty good. But you can only listen to Highway to Hell a certain number of times, so eventually I fell to listening to the crazed ramblings of Terence McKenna and the paranoid theorising of Alan Watt, not to be confused with Alan Watts. From Dover I put my car on the ferry to Calais, then I drove down through France, stopping for a night at a little hotel somewhere vaguely near Dijon, which only sticks in my mind because of the mustard connection. It was dark and raining cats and dogs when I turned off the road to find a hotel there, and it seemed like not all French motorways had markings, but possibly I just had bad luck. That particular motorway, in the rain, seemed to me to not have any markings on it. I don't know what was going on. It was pretty terrifying though, so I was glad to get into a hotel. After that, I drove across the top of Italy and I decided at the last moment to head up through Austria. I explored the hills a bit around Bolzano in the north there, and at a certain point when I was sitting eating a pizza in my car, a fox actually came right up to my car and begged for bits of pizza. I wish I'd filmed him, but filming things seemed pointless, considering. After a night in a hotel in the hills there, I carried on through Austria, stopping overnight near Vienna, and then I drove into Slovakia. My idea was to leave the car somewhere and go hiking through the wildest bits of Slovakia that I could find. I don't actually know much about Slovakia, but I know it has some fairly wild, mountainous countryside. Slovakia seemed to me to be wild enough and mountainous enough to satisfy my craving for the outdoors, and then when the disease finally got me, I reckon I'd be far enough from civilization that I could probably die in peace on my own terms. I was driving down a winding mountain road in Slovakia when I saw it. A car had smashed into a pine tree and the driver was slumped over the wheel. I pulled up and ran to see if the driver was alive or not. The car was smashed up pretty badly and it looked like the driver must have been crushed, but I was able to get the door open, and as soon as I opened it, he groaned. So clearly at least he wasn't dead. He was a youngish man, probably in his 20s, with fair hair and an angular face. I told him to hang on while I phoned for an ambulance, and at that he suddenly sat up, or as much as he could considering much of his body seemed to be trapped by the half-crushed wreck of the car, and he began shouting in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded more like Italian than Slovakian, not that I really knew what Slovakian sounded like anyway. I said to him something like, "I'm calling an ambulance, stay with me." And at that point he began shouting in English. He was like, "No, no ambulance, I'm fine." I said to him, "You're clearly not fine." And he said, "I'm okay really. I'm just trapped, help me out will you, I don't want an ambulance." So my first thought was that he must have hit his head and probably didn't realise how badly he was hurt. But he continued to insist that he was just trapped and definitely didn't need an ambulance. And I could see that he did actually appear entirely unharmed, even though the state of the car suggested he should have been dead. In view of my own position, I wasn't about to force medical attention on anyone who didn't want it, so I said, "Okay, what can I do?" I was looking doubtfully at the wreckage he was sitting in. He seemed to be pinned by his legs and the steering wheel, and the whole front of the car had telescoped into the back, so the back seat was pressing against the front seat. I just couldn't see how he was still alive. It had to be some sort of miracle. He said, "There's a jack in the back. I think you could use it to force the dashboard off me." So I almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. He was literally sitting in a wreck, yet there he was asking me to prise the wreck off him. I think I sort of sighed and raised my eyebrows and said something like, "Okay mate, I'll give it a go." The back of the car was a mess of shattered glass and distorted metal. It had smashed against the second tree after the front of the car had collided with the pine. There was no way I could extract anything from the boot, so I got the jack from my own car and started trying to use that to force apart bits of the wreckage that were keeping him pinned. The whole process took about an hour, but I managed to free him. The entire time I was shaking my head and marvelling at the fact that he appeared uninjured. I repeatedly tried to persuade him to let me call someone, but he wasn't having any of it. He said his name was Johnny, short for Giovanni, and he was an Italian, but his English was perfect. When I finally managed to extract him from the mangled car, he stood up, dusted himself off, and solemnly proffered his hand, like we were at a business meeting or something. I shook it and he said, "I am in your debt." I told him it was perfectly fine, I wasn't in a hurry anyway, and I asked him if he'd like a lift somewhere, and he said he wouldn't mind a lift to the nearest hotel, so we set off driving down the hill together. The whole thing was extremely weird. He didn't seem injured or ill or anything like that, but he did seem kind of edgy. He kept glancing behind us as if he thought someone dangerous was looking for him. I kept wondering about possible head injury, but the fact is there didn't seem to be a mark on him. I guess it's possible you can hit your head and your brain gets damaged by sort of banging against the front of your skull, and then you look from the outside like you're okay, but he didn't even have a scratch on him. I even half began to wonder if this was some kind of elaborate joke. By the time we found a hotel it was almost dark, so I decided to check in too. As it happened, it was lucky that he was with me because the receptionist spoke very little English, but Johnny turned out to be fluent in Slovakian. As he was heading for his room, I said to him on impulse, "I'm going to eat some food in a restaurant in about an hour, if you'd like to join me." And he said, "Sure thing, dinner's on me." At dinner, I watched him make short work of sausages, cabbages and potatoes. And bear in mind, this was a guy who was just in a car accident where the car was completely wrecked. And then after that, we went down to the bar for a drink. He still seemed edgy, but after about a beer and a half, he began to calm down a bit. I said to him, "You know, it's a miracle that you're still alive." And he said, "I was driving too fast. I don't drive very often." I asked him where he was going, but he was really vague about it. He would only say something about going to meet a friend. The whole thing was inordinately weird. Half of me still thought the whole thing must be some kind of a joke or the initial stages of a weird scam, and the other half wondered if he was off his rocker. He asked me where I was going, and I suppose my reply must have sounded pretty vague to him too. In spite of the fact that he wasn't very forthcoming, I had the impression he was glad of someone to talk to. and I was glad of the company myself, so we carried on drinking and talking about car accidents and Slovakia. I tried to ask him about Italy, and he vaguely implied that he came from somewhere near Trieste, but he talked as though he'd barely ever been to Italy. Half of what he said sounded like it came out of a guidebook. I said to myself, well, if it's a scam, he's not getting any money out of me, and if it isn't a scam, it's an interesting mystery. We were starting on our fourth beer when he said to me, "You know, you seem like a trustworthy guy. As soon as I saw you, I thought, there's a guy I can trust. I'm going to tell you something. You can believe it or not. It really doesn't matter to me." I said, "Go ahead." I was thinking, whatever he has to say, it couldn't make the day any weirder than it already was. He said, "How old do you think I am?" "I'm bad with ages," I told him. "Engines are my thing, people, not so much." "Have a guess," he said. So I said, "I don't know, about 28? And he said, "I'm 182. I nearly spat out my beer. "You're what?" "I'm 182 years old," he said. So I said to him, "How can you be?" And he said, "I'll explain it to you." He really appeared deadly serious. I was fairly sure that what I had on my hands was a fantasist. He probably wasn't an outright lunatic. He was perfectly coherent, but it did seem as though he really believed he was 182 years old, which clearly he wasn't. I half wondered if I didn't have some kind of legal responsibility. What are you supposed to do if you find a nutcase in the wreck of a car? Aren't there authorities that have to be informed? But the beer was working into my synapses and I was in the mood for a good story, so I let him talk on. The story he told me was absolutely ridiculous. It was the stupidest, most outlandish thing I've ever heard, and I make a habit of listening to outlandish stories for the sake of entertainment. I wish I'd written it all down as soon as possible afterwards, because there were a lot of details that I've forgotten now. Anyway, I'll tell you what I remember. He said that sometime towards the end of the 19th century, an Italian researcher had created a kind of brain out of fungus. It was kind of like a 19th century artificial intelligence sort of a thing. I can't remember the name that he mentioned, but it began with a C. So this brain was hyper intelligent and it could be set to work on any scientific problem, and it would just concentrate on the problem till it solved it. It didn't have any kind of independent will or instincts of its own. It was just a pure thinking, calculating machine made out of fungus. He said this researcher, name of Curse something or other, Car something like that, I don't know. He said the researcher had used the brain to create a whole new planet somewhere far away in our own galaxy. According to Johnny, he himself had lived till the age of 81 and had enjoyed a successful career as a historian at the University of Padua. When he was literally about to die, a representative of this scientist had come to him and offered him immortality. He, Johnny, had accepted, and he had been transported somehow to this distant planet and magically rejuvenated with technology presumably devised by this fungus brain. The problem was that the scientist had turned evil, and Johnny had escaped via some kind of portal along with several other people. They had their own scientist, he said, working on developing the kind of technology they would need to return to this planet and launch some sort of coup. Johnny was travelling to meet this scientist when his car slid off the road and hit a tree, and he claimed that the reason he hadn't been injured in the car accident was that a device embedded in his watch had protected him. He said it could basically heal all illnesses and protect against all accidents. So when he said that, I told him about my own medical condition, and what he said was, "Oh, that sounds bad," and he was slurring his words a bit due to the beer at that point. But he said, "I can fix it, but I don't have the kind of technology here that I had on Frith." This was what he called the planet that he'd come from. "The fix is going to be a bit weird." I told him I'd take his weird fix if he was offering one, and then he turned his watch towards him, the watch on his wrist, and he drew some symbols on the face of it with his finger. So you have to understand, this was a totally ordinary watch of the old-fashioned type with an hour and minute hand. It looked like something he might have bought for 50 quid at an antiques fair. And after he'd finished his finger motions, he said, "Tomorrow, you'll be cured." I laughed in his face. A more sensitive person might have been offended, but as far as I was concerned, Johnny was good entertainment. I asked him what he was planning to do next, and he said he'd continue his journey to meet this scientist who was working on the technology they needed to go and sort out this planet. The car accident didn't change his plans, and he said that on this distant planet, he used to crash cars for fun anyway. Cars were apparently only used as a form of entertainment on Frith, since they could fly wherever they wanted on flying hover bikes. Of course they could, why not? The only thing that worried him, he said, was the Italian scientist who created the planet, K or C something or other, had genetically engineered some kind of animal that Johnny said was chasing him. Whatever it was somehow able to overcome the protection embedded in his watch. He said that he had to be careful not to be outside at night for this reason, so he was very glad that I had come along when I did. He didn't want to be outside at night where this weird animal could get him. He told me a lot more about Frith, but I wasn't paying very close attention. I was a bit inebriated. I had other things on my mind, and it began to seem very obvious to me that these were just the delusions of a fantasist. He probably wasn't dangerous or mad as such. He was just one of those people who can't live in the real world. It was about 1 a.m. when we finally decided to get some sleep. I wished him good luck in case I didn't run into him the next morning. He said something weird to me about how I might want to write stuff down after I woke up. At the time I thought he had such an inflated idea of the importance of his own fantasies that he expected me to make notes on them. So I just said, "Yeah, thanks," and left it at that. During the night, I awoke at one point to some odd growling and scuffling sounds outside the hotel, but I put it down to a stray dog or maybe even a bear or a wild hog, and I went back to sleep. The next day when I awoke, my wife was with me. That was extremely strange because I didn't have a wife. Then I remembered, of course I have a wife, Jean, my wife. The next thought was that I shouldn't be there. When had I returned home? I should be in Slovakia somewhere. Jean said to me, "Are you okay?" I held my hand to my head, wondering about my illness. Then I realised, with huge relief, I didn't have any illness. I'd simply had a terrible dream. I was perfectly healthy. But no, that wasn't a dream. I had lived some kind of alternate life. And then I remembered that I wasn't even an engineer. I designed electronic circuits for a living. Some of the facts of my life had changed. Hadn't I met some Italian guy who claimed to be from another planet? I was in a state of deep confusion. Jean looked worried and she suggested I go back to bed for a bit. She felt my forehead, but she said she couldn't feel any fever. I lay down, but then a few minutes later I jumped up again and began to write down everything I could remember of my previous life or dream or whatever it was. I could feel that the memories of it were slipping away. By noon I could remember almost nothing of the dream, and I had only what I'd written down. Almost everything I've told you has come from those notes that I made then. Now I think what happened is I suffered from some temporary mental derangement that made me mistake a weird dream for a whole other life. Fortunately, nothing like that has happened to me since. Perhaps sometimes dreams can be so powerful that they exert an effect on the mind for an hour or two after they've ended. There is one strange thing that seems to fit with my weird dream. I kept an eye on the foreign news media for a couple of weeks after that, and I found a strange article on a Slovakian news site. It said a man of approximately 26 years old had been found dead by the side of the road. He had been attacked by some kind of animal, but the police weren't sure what kind of animal. The man's description matched what little I could remember of Johnny. It was probably just a coincidence. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please seal all your doors and windows to ensure that the creature can't get you, and then click the like and subscribe buttons. My name's John, and you've been listening to Science Horror. New episodes every weekend.